A Study in Scarlet. Part 1. Chapter 1. The story begins in 1878 with Dr. John Watson, the narrator, recounting his background. Watson took his medical degree from the University of London and became an assistant surgeon in the British Army. He was dispatched to India, but his regiment had already moved on to Afghanistan by the time he arrived. Watson caught up with his unit, but soon after, the Second Afghan War broke out. During the Battle of Maiwand, Watson was struck by a bullet in the shoulder. His orderly, Murray, bravely rescued him from the battlefield and got him to a hospital in Peshawar. While recovering, Watson contracted enteric fever, which nearly killed him. He was sent back to England on the troop ship Orontes with his health badly damaged. As an invalid with a small army pension of 11 shillings and sixpence per day, Watson drifted to London and took up residence in a hotel, living beyond his means. Realizing he needed to economize, Watson decided to find shared lodgings. By chance, he ran into an old acquaintance named Stamford at the Criterion Bar. Over lunch, Watson mentioned his search for affordable rooms. Stamford replied that another man had expressed the same desire that very day. Stamford's friend was looking for someone to split the cost of some nice lodgings he had found but couldn't afford on his own. Stamford warned Watson that the man, a Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was a bit eccentric. He worked in the chemical laboratory at the hospital where Stamford was a dresser. Holmes had deep knowledge of chemistry and anatomy, but appeared to be neither a practicing doctor nor a regular medical student. When Watson pressed Stamford for more information about Holmes's background and line of work, Stamford could provide little, saying Holmes was not easy to draw out about himself. Nonetheless, Watson was intrigued and eager to meet him. Stamford took Watson to the hospital laboratory to introduce him to Holmes. They found the young man engrossed in a chemical experiment. Holmes had discovered a test that could detect the presence of hemoglobin, providing a simple way to identify bloodstains, even very old ones. Holmes was overjoyed by the potential of his discovery for forensic detective work in criminal investigations. After Holmes demonstrated his test, Stamford made the introductions. Holmes immediately discerned that Watson had been in Afghanistan, much to Watson's astonishment. The two men agreed to view the rooms at Baker Street together, as they discussed their various quirks, including Holmes's pipe smoking, chemical experiments, and violin playing, and Watson's bull-pup and aversion to arguments. Both seemed to think they would be compatible flatmates. Watson and Holmes planned to meet the next day at noon to finalize the arrangements. As Watson and Stamford departed, Watson asked his friend how Holmes could have possibly known about his time in Afghanistan. Stamford just smiled, saying that was his little peculiarity, and many wondered how Holmes discovered things. Deeply intrigued, Watson looked forward to unraveling the mystery that was his new acquaintance, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. A Study in Scarlet. Part 1. Chapter 2. After deciding to take the lodgings at 221B Baker Street together, Watson moved his belongings from the hotel, and Sherlock Holmes joined him the following day. They quickly settled into a comfortable routine. Holmes was an agreeable companion with quiet, regular habits, although he sometimes spent days hardly moving or speaking, sunk into some torpid state. Watson wondered if Holmes used drugs during these periods, but his new friend's general temperance and cleanliness argued against it. Driven by curiosity, Watson tried to unravel the mystery of Holmes's life and work. The man's striking appearance with his tall, thin frame, piercing eyes, hawk-like nose and strong chin suggested both intellectual keenness and determined character. Holmes's hands bore the signs of chemical experiments, and he displayed an extraordinary delicacy of touch when manipulating scientific instruments. Without many friends himself, Watson hoped to learn more about his enigmatic flatmate. Holmes was clearly not a doctor or a formal student of science, although his knowledge in certain areas was both vast and precise. However, Holmes professed total ignorance of literature, philosophy, politics, and astronomy, considering any information that did not help his work to be useless clutter in his brain, which he endeavored to forget. If the Earth orbited the Moon, Holmes declared, it would make no difference to him. Watson jotted down an assessment of Holmes's knowledge and abilities, covering everything from his expertise in chemistry and anatomy to his skill in martial arts and playing the violin. The list demonstrated Holmes's eccentric but focused intellect. His musical talents were as peculiar as his other qualities. Though an accomplished violinist, Holmes preferred to scrape away discordantly on his instrument while lost in thought. Actual pieces were rare. Though initially friendless, Holmes soon revealed he had many acquaintances from all social strata who visited their rooms. These included a sallow-faced man named Lestrade, who came frequently on business. When clients called, Holmes would ask Watson for privacy to conduct interviews. Watson's curiosity finally got the better of his restraint, and he asked Holmes directly about his profession. As Watson anticipated, Holmes described himself as the world's only consulting detective. When other detectives from the official police force or private agencies were stymied, they brought their evidence to Holmes, who used his extensive knowledge of crime and his powers of deduction to put them on the right track. He could often solve mysteries without leaving his room. Holmes directed Watson's attention to an article he himself had authored on the science of deduction. In it, Holmes asserted that a trained observer could determine a man's history and occupation from the smallest clues in dress and appearance. The average person would consider such inferences fanciful, but to Holmes they were practical tools he relied upon for his livelihood. Watson scoffed at the article, prompting Holmes to reveal that his train of thought about Watson's time in Afghanistan, which so amazed the doctor when they first met, was achieved through a series of such rapid deductions. Holmes was disappointed, however, that most modern criminals displayed very little talent, making his own gifts hardly necessary. Just then the appearance of a retired sergeant of Marines at their door with a letter for Holmes promised a more engaging case was at hand. A Study in Scarlet. Part 1. Chapter 3. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson examine the note delivered by the commissionaire at the end of Chapter 2. It is from a Scotland Yard detective named Tobias Gregson, who requests Holmes's assistance in a mysterious murder case at 3 Lauriston Gardens off the Brixton Road. A man has been found dead in the empty house with no signs of a struggle, yet there is blood in the room. Holmes invites Watson along to investigate, declaring that the detective who solves the case will likely get all the credit regardless of Holmes's involvement. On the cab ride to the crime scene, Watson is surprised by Holmes's excited, talkative mood compared to his prior languid state in their rooms. Holmes reminds Watson that it is a capital mistake to theorize before collecting data, as it biases one's judgment. At Lauriston Gardens they find a house that looks ominous and gloomy. A crowd of onlookers has gathered outside. Holmes studies the pathway leading to the house, occasionally pausing to examine the ground. Inside they meet Gregson and another detective named Lestrade, who welcome Holmes while seeming to resent his presence. The victim is lying face up in the empty dining room. He is around 40 years old, with a heavy build and a snarling expression frozen on his face. The detectives confirm there are no wounds on the body. Holmes begins his examination, checking details of the man's clothes while sniffing his lips and even analyzing the soles of his boots. A wedding ring found under the body suggests a woman was present. The dead man's pockets contain several gold items, some loose cash, a novel, and letters identifying him as Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland. Another name, Joseph Stangerson, appears on the novel and one letter. While Gregson has followed up on Stangerson, he has conducted no other inquiries that Holmes considers crucial. Meanwhile, Lestrade has found what he believes is a major clue, the word rake scrawled in blood on the wall in a dark corner of the room. He thinks the murderer was interrupted while writing the name Rachel. Holmes laughs at this theory, much to Lestrade's annoyance. Holmes then conducts an exhaustive inspection of the room, crawling on the floor, measuring distances between undetectable points, collecting dust samples, and minutely examining the letters on the wall. Gregson and Lestrade look on with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. Following his investigation, Holmes declares there are definite signs pointing to the killer. He must be a man over 6 feet tall in his prime, with small feet for his height, wearing square-toed boots and smoking a Trichinopoly cigar. The murderer arrived with the victim in a 4-wheeled cab, drawn by a horse with 3 old shoes and 1 new. He likely has a ruddy complexion and long fingernails on his right hand. Holmes dismisses Lestrade's theory, noting, "Rach is the German word for revenge." With this parting shot, Holmes and Watson leave the detectives behind as they set off to continue the investigation on their own. A Study in Scarlet. Part 1. Chapter 4. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson leave the crime scene at 3 Lauriston Gardens and take a cab to the address given to them by Detective Lestrade. On the way, Holmes explains his reasoning for some of the deductions he made at the house. The height of the murderer, for example, was deduced from the length of his stride based on footprints and the tall writing on the wall. His age was estimated from the ease of his stride across a puddle. The appearance of long fingernails came from scratch marks in the bloody writing, and the ash on the floor could only have come from a Trichinopoly cigar, a brand Holmes has extensively studied. Watson is amazed but also confused by the strange details of the case. He can't reconcile the various facts and how it all occurred. Holmes assures him he has a good grasp of the main points, dismissing Lestrade's Rach theory as a ruse. He declines to explain everything to Watson, not wanting to give away all his methods. They arrive at the address, 46 Audley Court, to interview John Rance, the constable who discovered the body. Rance, appearing irritated at being woken up, agrees to recount his story in exchange for a half-sovereign coin from Holmes. Rance explains that around 2 a.m. he noticed a light on in the empty house on Lauriston Gardens while walking his beat. Knowing it should be vacant, he suspected something was wrong. At the door he felt uneasy and returned to the gate, considering fetching his partner for backup, but decided to enter the house alone. Holmes interjects with details of what Rance did inside, even though the constable hadn't mentioned them yet, thoroughly surprising him. Rance continues, saying he left and blew his whistle for assistance after confirming foul play, which summoned 3 other officers. When Holmes asks if anyone else was on the street, Rance recalls a very drunk man leaning on the railings, singing an odd song. He was tall, with a red face and a brown overcoat. The constable and his partner considered arresting him for public drunkenness, but were too occupied with the murder. The man's whip and cab were not seen. Holmes, excited by this information, gives Rance another half-sovereign, but says he missed a chance at promotion by not detaining the drunkard, who Holmes believes is the murderer. As Holmes and Watson depart in their cab, Watson remains confused why the killer would return to the scene of the crime. Holmes says he came back for the wedding ring, which will make good bait for catching him. Holmes thanks Watson for including him on the case, calling it a study in scarlet, a vivid mystery interwoven in the drabness of life waiting to be unravelled. Holmes is thrilled to have such an intricate problem to solve. His mind jumps from murder to music, however, as he joyfully anticipates a violin concert he plans to attend that afternoon, featuring a piece by Chopin. The contrast highlights for Watson the many-sidedness of the human mind. A Study in Scarlet, Part 1, Chapter 5. After Holmes leaves for his concert, Watson tries to rest but is too agitated by the day's strange events. He can't stop thinking about the murdered man's sinister expression and the many unanswered questions about his death. Holmes returns late in an excellent mood, musing about Darwin's theory on the origins of music stirring primal memories in the soul. Watson admits the case has shaken him more than his harrowing experiences in Afghanistan. Holmes shows Watson an evening newspaper that omits the detail about the woman's wedding ring found at the scene. Holmes reveals he placed an ad in the paper that morning saying the ring was found on Brixton Road and to contact Watson at their Baker Street address to claim it. When Watson objects that he doesn't have the ring to return, Holmes gives him a duplicate. Holmes is certain the killer, after realizing he lost the ring at the crime scene, will be desperate to retrieve it without arousing police suspicion, so he will jump at the chance when he sees the newspaper ad. Watson cleans and loads his revolver in preparation for the visitor Holmes anticipates within the hour. As they wait, Holmes examines an old Latin book on international law he bought at a stall and speculates about the 17th century lawyer who once owned it based on notes in the flyleaf. The doorbell rings, and they hear someone slowly ascend the 17 steps to their flat. To their surprise, instead of a violent criminal, an old woman enters, dazzled and blinking at the lights. The woman claims the ring belongs to her daughter Sally, recently married to a ship steward, who would be furious to find her without it, especially when he's drinking. She gives an address on Houndsditch as her residence. Holmes objects that Houndsditch is in the opposite direction of where the ring was allegedly found near Brixton Road. Under questioning, the woman provides a different address for Sally in Peckham. Watson returns the duplicate ring to get her to leave. As soon as she departs, Holmes grabs his coat and rushes out to follow her, believing the woman is an accomplice who will lead him to the killer. Watson waits up late for Holmes to return, unable to sleep without knowing what happened. Around midnight, Holmes enters looking disappointed, but then bursts out laughing. He explains the woman hailed a cab that he pursued to 13 Duncan Street, her original address. When Holmes arrived, the cabby was frantically searching his empty cab. There was no trace of the old woman, and no one by the name she gave resided at that address. Watson is astonished the apparently feeble old woman could escape a moving cab unseen. Holmes says they were fools to be deceived. The woman was clearly a young, agile man, and a masterful actor who realized he was being followed and tricked them. The killer is more formidable than Holmes imagined, with clever friends willing to help him. Holmes urges the exhausted Watson to go to bed. After Watson retires, he hears Holmes playing mournful tunes on his violin late into the night, still pondering the growing mystery. A Study in Scarlet. Part 1. Chapter 6. The morning papers are filled with accounts of the Brixton mystery. While they offer some new details, most of the reports engage in wild speculation about the murder being politically motivated due to the victim's foreign name, the cryptic message scrawled on the wall, and the lack of an obvious motive. Some papers blame liberal government policies for fostering lawlessness and weakening authority. The papers praise the detectives Gregson and Lestrade, anticipating they will quickly resolve the case. Holmes finds this amusing, confident the men will take credit regardless of the outcome. Just then, the Baker Street Irregulars, a group of street urchins Holmes employs as an informal intelligence network, rush in. Holmes sends them away, instructing them to continue searching for new information. Gregson arrives bursting with pride and eagerness to share his progress. He boasts he has the murderer, a man named Arthur Charpentier, in custody. His breakthrough came from tracing the victim Drebber's hat to his boarding house, run by Madame Charpentier. Interviewing Madame Charpentier and her daughter Alice, Gregson sensed they were withholding information. Under pressure, the daughter revealed Drebber had returned to the house drunk, after leaving for the train station with Stangerson the previous night. Drebber accosted Alice, attempting to persuade her to run away with him. Her screams brought her brother Arthur, a sub-lieutenant in the Navy, rushing to her defense. He confronted Drebber, chasing him from the house with a stick. Arthur returned hours later. The next morning, news of Drebber's murder reached them. Gregson theorizes that Charpentier attacked Drebber with the stick on Brixton Road, killing him, then dragged his body to the empty house to obscure the crime. He dismisses the other crime scene details like the candle, blood, ring, and writing as distractions. Holmes commends Gregson's work, stroking his ego, but seems primarily interested in the amount of time Charpentier was gone from the house and his lack of a credible alibi. Lestrade suddenly arrives looking disheveled and agitated. Before he can consult Holmes, Gregson bombards him with smug questions about his own investigation. Lestrade stuns everyone by revealing that Secretary Stangerson has been murdered that very morning at a hotel, blowing apart Gregson's tidy solution. In this chapter, the newspapers demonstrate the danger of rushing to judge a situation with limited facts, indulging in wild speculation, and using events to promote political agendas. Gregson's overconfidence in his airtight case against Charpentier proves premature once Lestrade brings new information to light. Holmes, however, seems to have anticipated more to the story, reserving judgment until he has all the facts. The sudden plot twist of Stangerson's murder while Charpentier was in custody introduces more uncertainty and complexity, showing that the mystery is far from solved. The friendly rivalry between Gregson and Lestrade, both eager to impress Holmes and outdo each other, adds an element of humor to the story. A Study in Scarlet. Part 1. Chapter 7. Detective Lestrade arrives with shocking news. Enoch Drebber's secretary, Joseph Stangerson, has been murdered at Halliday's private hotel. His body was found in his room with a deep stab wound to the heart and the word "rake" written in blood on the wall above him, just like at the scene of Drebber's murder. A milk boy reported seeing a tall man with a long coat descending a ladder from the open second-story window of Stangerson's room early that morning. Blood-stained water in the basin and marks on the sheets show the killer lingered to wash up after the crime. Stangerson still had Drebber's purse, ruling out robbery as a motive. The only clue was a month-old telegram from Cleveland in the dead man's pocket, reading, "J.H. is in Europe." Holmes is thrilled by this development, believing he now has all the pieces to solve the puzzle. He asks Lestrade for the 2 pills found in Stangerson's room. Dividing one in half, Holmes dissolves it in water and milk and feeds it to the sickly old terrier he previously asked Watson to examine. To their amazement, the dog dies almost instantly from the draught. When the same test with the second pill proves harmless, Holmes explains one must have contained deadly poison. He berates himself for not seeing it sooner. Holmes says the strange details of the case, far from making it more difficult to solve, actually provide the key to unraveling the mystery. He accuses Lestrade and Gregson of overlooking the one true clue that could have led them directly to the killer from the start. Impatient for answers, the detectives demand to know if Holmes has identified the murderer. Holmes admits he has, but says he needs time to set a trap to capture the man and his accomplice without tipping them off. He disparages the detectives' abilities compared to the cunning criminals. Gregson and Lestrade take offense at the insult to their profession. At that moment, Wiggins, the young leader of Holmes' street informants, arrives to announce a cab is waiting. Holmes casually opens a drawer and takes out a pair of handcuffs, asking why Scotland Yard doesn't use this newer model with an improved locking mechanism. The cabman then enters and Holmes asks for his help, strapping a portmanteau shut. As the cabman kneels down to assist, Holmes snaps the cuffs on him, triumphantly announcing the captive is Jefferson Hope, the murderer of Drebber and Stangerson. Chaos ensues as Hope furiously tries to escape, hurling himself through the window and fighting off all the men as they drag him back inside. His frenzied strength is only subdued when Lestrade nearly chokes him unconscious with his own collar. With the murderer finally restrained, Holmes declares the mystery solved and promises to answer all of Gregson and Lestrade's remaining questions. The dramatic confrontation and action-packed arrest of Jefferson Hope provides an exciting climax to this section of the novel. Holmes's clever trick with the handcuffs allows him to literally capture his suspect single-handedly, demonstrating his mental and physical prowess. The revelation of the killer's identity sets the stage for the remaining chapters to explore his background, motives, and the full circumstances behind the murders, tying up the loose ends of the case. A Study in Scarlet. Part 2. Chapter 1. The chapter shifts the setting to the barren Great Alkali Plain in the American West. The desolate landscape is described in vivid detail, emphasizing the unforgiving, inhospitable nature of the region. The only signs of life are buzzards circling overhead, foreshadowing death. A solitary traveler is introduced, a weathered, gaunt man clearly on the verge of death from hunger and thirst. He surveys the bleak, unending desert before him and resigns himself to dying there. Upon setting down his rifle and bundle, we learn the man has been carrying a young girl of about 5. The girl, Lucy, is initially upset at being jostled, but quickly reveals herself to be a cheerful, optimistic child, in contrast to the grim, hopeless mood of her companion. Through their conversation, it becomes clear the two are the sole survivors of a failed attempt to cross the desert by a 21-person party. The man has carried Lucy the final distance in a desperate, futile search for water. Lucy is unaware of how dire their situation is, assuming her mother and the others have simply gone ahead to a better place. The man doesn't have the heart to explain the finality of death to her. Instead, he encourages her to pray. In a poignant scene illustrating lost innocence, the world-weary man and innocent child kneel side by side to recite prayers from Lucy's memory. Exhausted, the man eventually drifts into a deep sleep beside her. As they slumber, an enormous caravan of 10,000 travelers appears on the horizon, heading west. The group is revealed to be Mormons fleeing persecution after being driven from their settlement in Illinois. Some of the younger men ride ahead to investigate a flash of color on a distant hillside, discovering the sleeping man and child. Lucy and her companion are brought before the caravan's leader, Brigham Young, and questioned. The man introduces himself as John Ferrier, explaining how he and Lucy came to be stranded. Young offers the pair sanctuary and aid on the condition that they convert to the Mormon faith. Desperate, Ferrier readily agrees. The caravan continues on its journey, taking the rescued pair with them into an uncertain future. The chapter serves as a jarring transition from the modern, urban world of London and the Holmes mystery to the untamed American frontier of the mid-19th century. The life-or-death struggle of the characters in a harsh, unforgiving landscape creates an atmosphere of danger and suspense. The sudden appearance of the Mormons injects questions about the role this religious community will play in the overarching story. Overall, the vivid descriptions of setting, characters and their plight sets an immersive stage for the backstory that will presumably tie back to the murder mystery introduced in Part 1, A Study in Scarlet, Part 2. Chapter 2. The chapter begins by describing the successful establishment of the Mormon settlement in Utah following their arduous journey. Under Brigham Young's leadership, the pioneers rapidly build a thriving community, with each person contributing their skills to the growing city and surrounding farmland. The two survivors from the opening chapter, John Ferrier and young Lucy, are warmly accepted into the community. Ferrier distinguishes himself as an able hunter and guide, earning the respect of his peers and a generous land grant. Time passes and Ferrier's farm prospers, making him one of the wealthiest men in the area. He remains single, however, refusing to take multiple wives, as is the custom among the Mormons. This earns him some criticism, but he is generally regarded as a pillar of the community for his unwavering faith and work ethic. Meanwhile, Lucy blossoms into a beautiful and lively young woman. Her grace and riding skills earn her many admiring glances. But as an innocent, she remains largely oblivious to the effect she has on others. One June morning, Lucy rides into Salt Lake City on an errand for her father. The town is busy with immigrants, gold prospectors and other travelers passing through on the overland route to California. On the outskirts of town, Lucy finds her path blocked by a herd of cattle. As she tries to weave through, her horse is spooked and nearly throws her amidst the stampeding beasts. At the last moment, a rough-looking young hunter comes to her rescue, pulling her to safety. The young man introduces himself as Jefferson Hope, of the pioneering Hope family from St. Louis. He compliments Lucy's riding skills and inquires about her father, John Ferrier, who apparently knew Jefferson's father years ago. Lucy invites Jefferson to visit their farm sometime. He happily accepts before Lucy rides off with a friendly farewell. Jefferson is instantly smitten with Lucy. Despite his focus on silver prospecting, he realizes his priorities have completely shifted. He will pursue Lucy's affections with all the determination and passion he applies to any challenge. Jefferson visits the Ferrier farm often and soon ingratiates himself with both Lucy and her father. His tales of travel and adventure out west make him a compelling figure. Lucy gradually falls for Jefferson, though her father seems not to notice. Months later, Jefferson visits Lucy to bid her farewell before embarking on another mining expedition. He confesses his love and asks if she'll be ready to marry him when he returns. Lucy shyly agrees, assuring Jefferson that John Ferrier has already given his blessing, provided Jefferson can get his mining venture underway. With a parting kiss, Jefferson reluctantly leaves his beloved behind, vowing to return as soon as he can. Lucy is left watching him go, filled with hope for their future together. This chapter further develops Lucy and her adoptive father as central characters in the unfolding story. It also introduces the romantic subplot between Lucy and Jefferson Hope, creating both personal stakes and the potential for future conflict within the close-knit Mormon community when their relationship becomes known. The passage of years and detailed descriptions help make the setting and characters feel vivid and dimensional as the story progresses. A Study in Scarlet, Part 2. Chapter 3. 3 weeks after Jefferson Hope's departure, John Ferrier anxiously awaits his return, dreading the loss of his adopted daughter Lucy to marriage. Though conflicted about Mormon beliefs, Ferrier has resolved never to allow Lucy to marry a Mormon, viewing such unions as shameful. However, he dares not voice this heretical view aloud, knowing the grave dangers of opposing the Church's will. The narrator describes the omnipotent and mysterious power the Mormon Church wields over its followers, employing secret groups like the Danites or Avenging Angels to violently punish dissenters and troublemakers. No one dares speak out against the Church for fear of swift retribution from this invisible force. Rumors circulate of murdered immigrants, kidnapped women forced into polygamous marriages, and roving bands of masked vigilantes terrorizing the countryside, intensifying the atmosphere of dread and paranoia. One morning, Ferrier is visited by Brigham Young himself. The Mormon leader reminds Ferrier of all the Church has done for him, rescuing him and Lucy from the desert, sharing food and land, and allowing him to prosper under their protection. In return, Young says, Ferrier promised to embrace Mormonism fully, including plural marriage. He chastises Ferrier for failing to wed and chides him for allowing Lucy to remain single in violation of church doctrine. Young reveals that Lucy has caught the eye of several high-ranking Mormon elders. He gives Ferrier 1 month for Lucy to choose between the sons of 2 church leaders, Stangerson and Drebber, insisting she must marry a faithful Mormon. Ferrier protests that Lucy is too young, but Young threatens him ominously should he defy the will of the church council on this matter. After Young departs, Lucy emerges, having overheard the conversation. She is pale and frightened, but Ferrier comforts her, promising to send word to Jefferson about their predicament. He believes Jefferson will swiftly return for Lucy once he hears the news. Lucy fears for her father's safety, knowing how the church deals with those who oppose them. Ferrier reassures her, vowing to flee Utah with her if necessary before submitting to the church's demands. He says he will defend his land with force if the church tries to take it. Despite his bold words, that night, Ferrier takes the precaution of thoroughly locking up the house and loading his old shotgun before bed, betraying his underlying anxiety about the threats facing his family. The tense situation builds a sense of foreboding and urgency as the story progresses. This chapter deepens the reader's understanding of the social and political power dynamics within the insular Mormon community that will influence Jefferson and Lucy's love story. The strict religious authoritarianism and practice of polygamy create complications for the young couple and raise questions about how they can overcome these daunting obstacles. The menacing confrontation with Brigham Young, along with references to shadowy sects like the Danites, inject elements of danger and suspense into the plot, foreshadowing the conflicts to come as the characters resist the church's control over their lives. A Study in Scarlet. Part 2. Chapter 4. The morning after his confrontation with Brigham Young, John Ferrier travels to Salt Lake City to send a message to Jefferson Hope, informing him of the danger he and Lucy face. Upon returning home, Ferrier is surprised to find the sons of elders Drebber and Stangerson waiting for him. They arrogantly announce their intention to compete for Lucy's hand in marriage, citing their wealth and status. Ferrier angrily throws them out, prompting the young men to threaten retribution for defying the prophet. Ferrier fears for their safety, but tries to reassure Lucy that Jefferson will return for her soon. He expects to receive some censure from Young for his disobedience, but is shaken when he finds a small square of paper pinned to his bed the next morning, reading, "29 days are given you for amendment, and then." The ominous message leaves him puzzled as to how it got there. Each day, the number on the paper mysteriously changes, counting down to some unspecified but undoubtedly grim fate. The psychological torment takes its toll on Ferrier, leaving him haggard and restless. As the days dwindle with no word from Jefferson, Ferrier begins to despair, seeing no way to escape the tight control the Mormons exert over the settlement. On the evening of the second to last day, Ferrier sits despondently at his table, fearing for his and Lucy's future. Suddenly, he hears a faint scratching sound at the door. Thinking it may be an assassin sent by the Mormons, Ferrier flings open the door, only to find Jefferson Hope lying on the ground. Jefferson quickly enters and explains he made a stealthy approach because the house is being watched. Jefferson has brought horses and supplies for their escape. He plans to take Lucy and her father through a narrow mountain pass to Carson City that night, using the cover of darkness. Ferrier gathers his money, and Lucy prepares a bundle of her most precious belongings. They carefully make their way out of the house and across the fields. Just as they are about to enter the mountains, Jefferson pulls them into hiding. 2 Mormon sentinels appear out of the darkness and use a secret code to communicate. Once they depart, Jefferson leads his party forward, knowing they must move quickly now. With Jefferson guiding them along a treacherous path, they ascend into the mountains. Despite the danger and difficult terrain, the group is elated to be leaving the despotic Mormon society behind. Their joy is tempered, however, when they encounter a lone Mormon sentinel guarding the pass. Using the countersignal he overheard from the previous sentinels, Jefferson convinces the sentry to let them proceed. Passing the watchman, they spur their horses to a trot, relieved to have cleared this final obstacle to freedom. The chapter ends on a tentatively hopeful note, with the runaways unaware of the retribution and dangers that will soon pursue them. This chapter ratchets up the tension as the threat to Ferrier and Lucy intensifies. The mysterious daily messages create an atmosphere of dread and paranoia, underscoring the reach and ruthlessness of the Mormon hierarchy. Jefferson's bold plan offers a glimmer of hope, but the harrowing late-night flight through the wilderness emphasizes the long odds against them. With Mormon lookouts and patrols everywhere, the reader is left with the sense that escaping completely will be much harder than the fleeing family realizes. A Study in Scarlet. Part 2. Chapter 5. Jefferson Hope leads John and Lucy Ferrier through the treacherous mountain paths, constantly alert for signs of pursuit. By the second day, with their provisions running low, Hope leaves the Ferriers to hunt for food. After several fruitless hours, he finally kills a mountain goat, but in his eagerness, Hope gets lost returning to camp in the fading light. When he finally finds the path leading back, he shouts joyfully to alert his companions, but receives no response. Hurrying into their hiding place, he finds the camp deserted, except for the smoldering remains of a fire. Horse tracks indicate a large party of riders had overtaken the fugitives and returned to Salt Lake City. Desperately searching for clues, Hope finds a freshly dug grave with a makeshift headstone, identifying it as John Ferrier's resting place. Realizing Lucy must have been recaptured and forced to go through with the marriage, Hope sinks into despair. But thoughts of revenge soon rekindle his resolve. For days he relentlessly retraces his steps back to the settlement, driven by an indomitable thirst for vengeance. Arriving back in the valley, Hope spots celebratory flags flying in Salt Lake City. He learns from a passing Mormon acquaintance that Lucy was married to Drebber the previous day. Apparently there was some argument between Drebber and Stangerson over who would claim her, but Drebber's faction proved dominant. The Mormon also callously remarks that Lucy looked deathly ill at the wedding and likely won't live long. Shattered, Hope retreats into the wilderness to nurse his grief and plot retribution. Within a month, word reaches him that Lucy has indeed died, whether from heartbreak over her father's death or the trauma of the forced marriage. In a daring move, Hope sneaks into the room where Lucy's body is laid out and kisses her forehead in farewell, snatching the wedding ring from her finger before escaping. Hope then begins terrorizing Drebber and Stangerson, stalking the outskirts of the city and making attempts on their lives. The men lead posses into the wilderness to kill Hope, but always fail. Eventually, feeling the strain of his harsh life as a fugitive, Hope reluctantly retreats to the Nevada mines to rebuild his strength and fortune, knowing he must stay alive to fulfill his vengeance. Though he plans to only be away a year, it is 5 years before Hope can return. In that time, Drebber and Stangerson have fled Salt Lake City as part of a schism in the Mormon community, taking their wealth with them. Undeterred, Hope begins a dogged pursuit that spans years and thousands of miles, trailing them from city to city across America and eventually to Europe. Finally catching sight of them in Cleveland, Hope's bloodlust surges. But before he can act, Drebber spots him and reads the murderous intent in his eyes. Drebber preemptively has Hope arrested and detained on trumped-up charges, giving him and Stangerson time to sail for Europe. After weeks in jail, Hope is released, only to find his quarry escaped. With admirable persistence, Hope tracks the men to St. Petersburg, Paris, Copenhagen, and finally London. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger, mentioning that what transpires in London is recorded in Dr. Watson's journal, which has been the source for the strange tale being recounted. This chapter is full of action and heartbreak, as Hope's dreams for a future with Lucy are dashed. His transformation into a hardened vigilante, devoting his life to avenging his lost love, lends a dark, gothic tone to the story. Drebber and Stangerson's flight across 2 continents emphasizes their guilt and creates a globe-spanning chase. Hope's implacable pursuit, sacrificing years of his life, demonstrates both his resourcefulness and the depth of his obsession. The reference to Dr. Watson's journal at the end provides a reframing perspective, reminding readers that this frontier romance and revenge thriller is part of the larger mystery introduced in the novel's opening chapters. With this plot turn, the backstory of the crime in London starts to come into focus. A study in Scarlet. Part 2, Chapter 6. After his dramatic arrest, Jefferson Hope surprisingly turns cooperative. At the police station, he expresses his willingness to confess everything, despite warnings it will be used as evidence against him. When Watson examines Hope, he discovers that the man is suffering from a fatal aortic aneurysm, likely a result of his arduous life in the mountains. Realizing he has little time left, Hope insists on giving his full account. He begins by declaring his unwavering conviction that Drebber and Stangerson deserved to die for what they did to Lucy and her father. Though the long years made a legal case impossible, Hope appointed himself their judge, jury, and executioner. Hope details how he survived in London through work as a cabbie while doggedly searching for his prey. After 2 weeks of constant surveillance, he finally spotted an opportunity when Drebber and Stangerson had a drunken falling out, going their separate ways. Hope seized his moment for revenge. He describes how years ago, while working as a janitor at a college, he stole some powerful poison that a professor had distilled from an arrow tip. He explains how he put the poison in identical pills, planning to give his victims a fatal game of chance, a poetic means of execution. On the fateful night, Hope picked up an inebriated Drebber and took him to the house on Brixton Road. There he revealed his identity and presented Drebber with the pills, one poisoned and one harmless, forcing him to choose. Drebber picked the poisoned pill and died quickly in agony, a wedding ring held before his eyes. On a whim, Hope dipped his finger in his own nosebleed and scrawled "Rach" on the wall to misdirect investigators, recalling a famous murder case in New York. On his way out, Hope was confronted by a constable, but escaped suspicion by feigning drunkenness. The next morning, Hope scaled the wall of the hotel where Stangerson was staying. He awoke Stangerson and again offered a deadly choice. But Stangerson tried to fight him off, and Hope stabbed him in self-defense. Regardless, Hope believes Stangerson would have chosen the poisoned pill anyway, as Providence would never have allowed his guilty hand to pick out anything but the poison. Hope intended to continue working as a cabbie to save money for a return to America, but he was surprised to be summoned by Holmes's advertisement and walked into the trap. Still, he seems to harbor no resentment toward his captors. Holmes asks about the person who actually showed up for the ring, and Hope winks, saying he doesn't want to get anyone else in trouble, but that his friend had done the job smartly. As the chapter concludes, the police inspector notes that Hope will be brought before the magistrates on Thursday for a formal hearing. Watson and Holmes then depart the station to return to Baker Street. This lengthy chapter serves as the climax of the story, with Jefferson Hope finally taking center stage to deliver his own narrative. His grim life story puts the strange events of the novel into context while raising complex moral questions. Hope's zealous pursuit of justice by any means is portrayed with a certain sympathy, as is his deep devotion to Lucy. Yet his coldly calculated poisoning of Drebber and brutal stabbing of Stangerson complicate his image as a heroic avenger. The link to Holmes's trap with the ring neatly connects the flashback to the opening chapters. With Hope's full confession delivered, the stage is set for the novel's denouement, A Study in Scarlet. Part 2, Chapter 7. The novel concludes with a short chapter tying up loose ends. Watson informs us that there was no need to provide testimony at Jefferson Hope's trial, as the suspect had died suddenly in his cell the night after his arrest. The aortic aneurysm that had been causing him pain throughout his later years had finally ruptured. Watson notes that Hope died with a placid smile, suggesting he felt at peace having avenged Lucy and her father. Holmes remarks that Gregson and Lestrade will be disappointed by Hope's death, as it robs them of the publicity they hoped to gain from the case. Watson argues the detectives had little to do with the actual capture, but Holmes responds cynically that perception trumps reality. What matters, he says, is what one can make people believe. Despite this, Holmes is thrilled by the case's resolution and considers it one of the most fascinating he's encountered, even if it was fundamentally simple. He claims that without any assistance, he was able to identify the culprit within 3 days using basic deduction. Holmes then launches into a detailed explanation of his reasoning process. Starting from the beginning, Holmes noted the cab tracks at the crime scene and deduced the killer must have arrived with the victim in a growler, a type of horse-drawn cab. The footprints in the clay soil revealed there were 2 men, one tall and the other fashionably dressed. Inside, Holmes surmised the tall man must be the killer since Drebber was in common dress. The sour smell on Drebber's lips suggested poison, and his agitated expression showed he feared for his life before death, not typical of a natural demise. With no signs of robbery, Holmes concluded this was a personal crime of passion, likely over a woman. The Ring confirmed this theory. Holmes critiques Gregson for not pressing Cleveland police for details on Drebber's past in his telegram. Upon examining the room, the blood spatter indicated a full-blooded man, matching the physical description Holmes had already constructed. Holmes then took the initiative to contact Cleveland police himself and learned of Jefferson Hope, Drebber's rival for Lucy's affections, now traveling in Europe. He deduced that Hope had become a London cabbie as the perfect cover to stalk his prey unnoticed. Therefore, Holmes deployed his street Arab youths to canvass cab companies until they located the suspect. The murder of Stangerson had been unexpected but unavoidable. It did provide Holmes the crucial evidence of the pills to confirm his theory. Watson remarks that Holmes' gifts should be publicly recognized and offers to publish an account of the adventure. He shows Holmes the day's newspaper, which contains an article about the case. Far from acknowledging Holmes, however, it credits Lestrade and Gregson with the smart capture, and condescendingly refers to Holmes as an amateur who may develop some skill under the tutelage of the professionals. A bitter Holmes shrugs this off as the result of all our study in Scarlet. Watson has the last word, however, vowing that the public will learn the truth when he publishes his own journal, chronicling the real story behind this remarkable case. The novel ends on a humorously esoteric note, with Watson comparing Holmes to a miserly Roman who counts his coins at home, indifferent to the taunts of the masses, content with his private wealth. This chapter serves as a typical detective story denouement, in which the mystery's solution is explained in detail while situating the preceding events in a larger social context. Holmes emerges as the unsung hero, his astonishing mental feats unappreciated by the public and actively downplayed by professional jealousy. Yet Holmes retains the eccentric bohemian spirit of the true artist, satisfied by his own genius, regardless of fame or fortune. Watson assumes his role as the chronicle of his friend's adventures, promising he will be Holmes's evangelist to the world. The sly, ironic tone of the conclusion foreshadows the dynamic that will come to define the duo's subsequent outings, with Holmes's dazzling brilliance witnessed by the admiring Watson, but frequently taken for granted by the official powers that be. The ending both wraps up the current case on a thought-provoking note, while leaving the door open for many more adventures to come.